Tree rings indicate a recent catastrophic flood and a recent earth. One valuable natural chronometric device is the common tree and its annual growth rings and their patterns. Both living and dead trees can be used in this science, known as dendrochronology. Perhaps the most intriguing of the unanswered questions regarding longevity in conifers, evergreen trees, has to do with Sequoia gigantea trees, which some believe may enjoy perpetual life in the absence of gross destruction, since they appear immune to pest attack. Does this mean that shortly preceding 3,275 years ago, the old age of the oldest conifers, wow, all the then living giant sequoias were wiped out by some catastrophe, like the flood? Edmund Schulman, microscopic study of growth rings, reveals that a bristlecone pine tree found last summer at nearly 10,000 feet began growing more than 4,600 years ago, and thus surpasses the oldest known sequoia by many centuries. Many of its neighbors are nearly as old. We have now dated 17 bristlecone pine trees 4,000 years old or more. Edmund Schulman. Since these, as well as the sequoias and other ancient trees, are still living, it is pertinent to ask why these oldest living things apparently have had time to develop only one generation, since they acquired their present stands at some time after the deluge. There is no record of a tree or any other living thing being older than any reasonable date for the deluge. Historical records indicate a recent civilization, not an old evolved one. In the last analysis, the only really reliable recorder of time is man himself. In any kind of natural process that might be used to determine past time, there is always the possibility that the rates may be changed, as well as uncertainty regarding its initial condition. It is absolutely impossible to know beyond question that such and such a formation or deposit has an age of so many years unless that age is supported by reliable human records of some kind. And it is therefore highly significant that no truly verified archaeological datings antedate the time of about 3000 BC or even later. Larger dates are of course frequently ascribed to various localities and central cultures, but they are always based on radiocarbon or other geological methods rather than written human records, and they are hardly ever reliable. There are numerous extant chronologies that have been handed down from various ancient peoples, and it is bound to be significant that none of them yield acceptable evidence that the histories of these and other peoples antedate the biblical date for the deluge. The Bible pictures the dispersal of post-diluvian man from the geographical areas implied also by archaeology and secular history. The most ancient peoples leaving historical records were, of course, the inhabitants of the Tigris, the Euphrates Valley, the Nile Valley of Egypt, and other Near Eastern cities. This correlates perfectly with the Bible records, which picture the centrifugal movement of tribes out from the first kingdom of Babylon. It is remarkable how many different lines of evidence of a historical nature point back to a time around 3000 BC as dating the beginning of true civilization. The worldwide testimony of trustworthy recorded history is therefore that such history begins about 3000 BC and not substantially earlier. This is indeed surpassingly strange if men have actually been living throughout the world for many tens of hundreds of thousands of years. But on the other hand, if the biblical records are true, then this is, of course, exactly the historical evidence we would expect to find. And it is pertinent to mention in passing the worldwide incidence of flood legends. It is not at all unreasonable to conclude that the clear reality of the great world deluge, which remade the world in the days of Noah. the world's population testifies to a young Earth. Ever since the famous studies of Malthus, it has been known that human populations have tended to increase geometrically with time. At the time of the birth of Christ, there presumably were from 250 to 350 million persons on this planet. Some 700 years later, there was about the same number, say 300 million, a long, slow decline in the total population having been followed by a compensating increase. It took roughly 950 more years, namely until 1650, for this 300 million to double to 600 million. But then it took only 200 years from 1650 to 1850 for the next doubling up to 1,200 million, or 1.2 billion. From 1850 to 1950, in only 100 years, the Earth's population doubled again to about 2.4 billion. Warren Weaver. It could not be maintained, of course, that this calculation is completely rigorous, but it certainly is reasonable, far more so than to say that the population has been doubling itself since the hypothetical beginning several 100,000 years ago, which would bring the world's population to a number in the trillions. One must also reckon with the probability that population increase rates in the early centuries after the flood, as well as those before the flood, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, as recorded in Genesis 6:1, may have been abnormally high owing to the great longevity of mankind at that time. According to the records, men lived 900 years or more before the flood. One of the strongest evidences of the validity of these figures is the fact that after the flood, the ages of the patriarchs exhibit a slow but steady decline from that of Noah, who lived 950 years, through Eber, who lived 464, Abraham, who died at 175, Moses, who died an old man at 120, to the familiar biblical 70-year lifespan, Psalm 90 and 10, which is very close to where we have returned today. Large early post-diluvial populations are also intimated by the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and the account of the dispersion in Genesis 11. Thus, these early high rates of doubling would more than counterbalance whatever evidence there may be of slower rates during the first 1,500 years after Christ. And incidentally, the declining lifespan after the flood seems to fit in perfectly with our concept of the dissipation of the Earth's protective blanket, superfrozen water canopy during the flood. As we noted, this canopy provided a warm, pleasant, presumably healthful environment throughout the world. Perhaps the most important effect of the canopy was the shielding action provided against the intense radiations impinging upon the Earth from space, especially the sun. Shortwave radiation, wavelength radiation, as well as bombardment of elementary particles of all kinds, is known to have damaging effects, both somatic and genetic effects on organisms, and this is generally true for all types of radiations. A single dose of radiation, which does not kill an animal within the period of acute radiation sickness, may tend to shorten life. Austin Bruce. If such effects can be observed in a short lifetime as a result of artificial radiations, it is certainly possible that much greater effects on longevity would have been produced over the millenniums by the natural background radiation. Even more significant than these somatic effects, however, are the genetic effects of radiation, which injure not only the individual receiving the first exposure, but also his descendants as well. And the nature of these mutations is practically always, perhaps unqualifiedly always, so far as the laboratory evidence goes, harmful. James Crow. As a matter of fact, only the rare, gross mutations tend to die out naturally. The great majority of them are only slightly harmful and continue to survive. Their descendants also survive, perhaps with additional mutations, and the net result is bound to be an overall deterioration of the species. This undoubtedly is why the fossil record reveals living creatures before the flood of all kinds to be larger and better equipped than their modern descendants. So much for evolution. With devolution, it surely is quite reasonable in view of what is known about the somatic and genetic effects of radiations to infer that, over the centuries since the flood, The accumulation of these effects in man, in particular, has resulted in gradual deterioration and decreasing lifespan. Continuing catastrophic activity contradicts uniformitarianism. The tectonic and volcanic disturbances which played such a large part in the initiation of the flood, as well as in the uplift of the land at its close, continued with only gradually lessening intensity for many centuries thereafter. For from the viewpoint of biblical catastrophism, it is very difficult to determine precisely which deposits were laid down in the deluge proper and which are attributable to the disturbed centuries after the flood. This is exactly what we should expect in light of the biblical implications concerning the character and extent of the deluge. Although the flood subsided enough so that Noah and the animals could disembark from the ark after only 1 year, the profoundly disturbed and altered hydrological and isostatic balances of the earth undoubtedly continued to manifest themselves in what might be called residual catastrophism for many centuries at least. Here's something, I've used this in a number of cases. Vase found in prehistoric rock. Prehistoric rock indicates civilization has always been extant, pointing to a recent creation which always included mankind. Here's a picture of it. This vase was found in 1851, Dorchester, Massachusetts, discovered in solid rock. How'd that happen? Well, worldwide flood. Lots of stuff comes all the way down, covers up these artifacts like this one, and the sediment becomes solid rock, and then you dig it open, and there it is. The rock formation is found as the Roxbury conglomerate, which is Precambrian, supposedly over 534 million years old. This rock is supposed to be a record of life on Earth before any multicellular life evolved. Yet here is an undeniable human artifact. Man supposedly appeared no more than 2.5 million years ago in his most primitive form, according to evolution. This object refutes the whole evolutionary interpretation of the strata we see worldwide and supports the creationist assertion that most of the strata were formed during the global flood. This could be an artifact from a pre-flood civilization. The June 15, 1852 Scientific American article, pages 289 and 299, about this alloy vessel says something interesting. The editor suggests that the vessel may have been made by Tubal-Cain, the biblical father of metallurgy. Tubal-Cain is found in Genesis 14:22, before the flood. This same scientific magazine today is totally anti-creationist and anti-biblical. Darwin had not succeeded in getting the educational institutions to preach his theory yet. The evidence supports a literal reading of Genesis and totally destroys the evolutionary idea of millions and billions of years for the formation of the geologic record. Conclusion. A catastrophe, a catastrophic universal flood, is the only way to explain the Earth today. Throughout the 18th century as well into the 19th, most theologians and scientists of the Western world correctly believed that the deluge was responsible for the major fossiliferous strata of the Earth. But the rise of Cuvier's false theory of successive catastrophes, which assigned most of the fossil strata to ages long before the creation of man, which is totally unbiblical, caused many to abandon the older and biblical flood theory of geology in spite of unsubstantial claims. William Buckland led the way in Great Britain by falsely pointing to diluvium deposits as positive evidence of the last and greatest catastrophe in a fictitious series of catastrophes in the history of Earth, the Genesis flood. But no sooner had a large number of Christians accepted the successive catastrophes view than Buckland and Sedgwick, along with other geologists, began to make public recantations of their former views. The diluvium deposits were no longer attributed to flood, but to the last of a series of pre-Adamic the catastrophes. The flood, though